I just want to say I am terribly sorry. When I was talking about Argo, I said Casey Affleck, when in fact the lead actor was Ben Affleck. And for the Edgar Wright film in the Three Cornettos trilogy, it was actually The World's End, which I kept calling it The End of the World, which is a separate movie entirely. So thanks to Greg for pointing those out and emailing me about the corrections for that one. I want to say, though, that the pride of that episode was the fact that I did correctly name and date the Three Ninjas Knuckle Up. And so I take this as a net win, regardless.
Should we just go ahead and replace our logo with the Three Ninjas logo, or just call this the Three Ninjas podcast?
Watch Three Ninjas.
I'll watch Three Ninjas finally. That'll be our 100th episode. Three Ninjas.
That's our 100th episode. We watch Three Ninjas. That's a perfect one. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Watch No Evil. This is Matt.
And this is Zach.
And today we're going to be putting the B in LGBT. We're reviewing The Babadook, the 2014 Australian horror film.
Is this Australian?
Yeah.
Oh, we did 2 Aussie weeks in a row.
I know, right?
I thought it was British.
Nope, this is an Aussie horror film. It was produced by Christina Caton, Christina Moliere, and it was directed, I believe, by Jennifer Kent.
Yes.
Who is also the screenplay writer and who wrote the original movie that it's based on, which was called Monster, which she also refers to as The Little Babadook. This movie, also, like Cargo, is based on a previous movie by the same director. Not the same director as Cargo, but the same director from short film to full-length film, so...
I guess that happens in Australia a lot.
Well, it's really interesting because there's so much about this movie that connects to other things that we've done. Like when she's watching the TV and the old woman is rising from the bed, that is her watching the Mario Bava film Black Sabbath, which was also based on or inspired by some of the German expressionist films that this movie draws inspiration from. So there's a lot of nice connectivity there.
Yeah, we should probably watch a Mario Bava film sometime. They look,
we have to.
They look like they're pretty good, so.
I love the particularly surreal feel that all of his films have, especially in the way that they do color and lighting. And I think that this film also does an exceptional job of lighting the film. It reminds me in a way, the same way that we talked about The Conjuring. There's so much in the lighting of this movie that connects to the theme of the movie. Just the way that even when they're outside, it's really overcast and it's gray. And the way that they light the actual actors in this film, it gives them almost like this grayish undertone to their skin, which to me is sort of pseudo reminiscent of that black and white German expressionist era that it's clearly trying to draw from.
Yeah, I think Sleepy Hollow was the other one where we were referencing Mario Bava, and that kind of had a similar feel to it, where it is this very gothic kind of feel, as we talked about a lot there, but also had this really washed out gray, dark kind of tone to it. And I think that this has a similar thing. I think the really the brightest part of it is at Sam's cousin's birthday party, like when he pushes her out of the treehouse, and I don't know
Certainly.
if that means anything, but it's, they're outside and overall it's really dark.
It's one of the few times in the movie where they're physically outside, and, we say sort of that they are outside when she's driving the car, but even in that, the way that they do shadowing and the way that she's driving down a street that has tree coverage, it still has this sort of claustrophobic feel to it. And the way that they shoot so close to her face, and it's like, she's in a car, she's driving, but it makes it still feel like she is inside the world. We don't get any like, panoramic shots of the outside world. Typically we'll get like a long shot of the car driving down the road. And so we'll get to see this like, rustic, rural, urban backdrop, or, residential rather is really what I'm getting at, where we actually get to see signs of other life. And in this case, it's maintaining that claustrophobia, even when we know that they are not in a claustrophobic setting. And actually, everything about this movie, it feels really, really tight and really condensed. When they're doing the shots with the other woman, the neighbor, there's always like really close up on her, especially when speaking. We get a lot of the face shots and we get this very boxy image. And I think that goes along with sort of the theme of depression that the movie sort of takes on, and that like overwhelming closeness and sort of negative intimacy that is associated.
Yeah, I think going along with that theme, I think there are two ways that you could go about portraying a theme of depression in a cinematic kind of way. And that's one, in this way, where you get this kind of like boxy, closed off kind of feeling. Or you could go the opposite, or you can really like take this wider approach, and just to make the characters seem like more of like a small part of things, like they're a microcosm of what is really going on.
The agoraphobia versus claustrophobia,
right?
Dichotomy, the making of smallness by using shot composition to physically portray them as small and force that perspective versus the claustrophobic. And they do the claustrophobic, I think, really well. Right.
And I think to tie into the cinematic kind of camera work that goes in here, it also with like sudden scene changes, there's so much jarring effect in that. They'll have like there's some scenes that last a matter of seconds where you just get a little glimpse of like what happened in this time frame, and sometimes it'll be like nothing really that significant, and then it'll suddenly shift to, oh, here's the next day or whatever. And they have some of the sound design matches that, and some of the soundtrack matches that too, where you'll just have this like buzzing sound going on in the background, which we may talk about later, and then it'll suddenly cut out when Amelia does something, or it'll just switch to the next scene, and it stops suddenly with the scene change. And I think there is this jarring sudden change is almost to like give you this effect that Amelia might be feeling of like losing track of time, or just not kind of having these gaps.
Mm-hmm. Which losing track of time and sort of the way that time can slip away from you is really symptomatic of depression, especially when you have the type of people that experience it in the way that it's showing Amelia experiencing it, which is she lacks the sort of energy to clean. And so you see her house getting dirtier and disgusting, and that's represented by when the cockroaches start coming out of the wall, and then the fast juxtapositions to this almost like manic cleaning phase, and juxtaposing those with the way that there will be endless nights of no sleep, and it feels like even when she says that, she's not getting any sleep, it shows a lot of shots of her, lying in bed, and it's that sort of constant wokenness where the sleep is not meaningful, but rather it is the inability to get up and be active. And I think that it's well represented in the claustrophobic shots as well, because we know that part of the theme of this movie is her own inability to admit that she has an issue, and that she is repressing all of those emotions. And, repression is that very intimate sensation where everything is bottled up really tight and deep down inside. And so we get to see that in the physical composition of the shots. Because I feel like with Amelia, a lot of the shots, at least when we are supposed to be seeing the movie through Amelia's perspective, they're very tight. They're really close up, versus when we see them from Samuel's perspective, where we do sort of get these fuller body shots of her as this sort of imposing or scary figure. and we get to see, Samuel almost always as like a full body shot. We never see the same level of closeness in his face as we do with Amelia. And I think that that's part of the repression aspect as well.
What comes to mind for me when you describe that like kind of close-in shot is like when she's looking at the TV. Like, so they do this a few times where they're sit in front of the TV, and you'll get like that zooming in on the TV as if you're looking at it from her perspective, and you get this kind of like closed-in feeling when they do that shot. And then when they show Sam watching TV, it just shows him in the same room as the TV, and like the TV's on, like when he's watching his magic DVD.
Yeah, it shows him watching the movie, and it does show Amelia watching, but there's a significant amount of interaction visually between Amelia and the TV, and that's because it's trying to also tie in Amelia's depression and the inability to do things with the mundaneness of the advertisements that they show on TV, as well as the German expressionist films that show up on the television. So it's this simultaneous like mundaneness and the outpouring of emotion, because one of the facets of German expressionism is that all of the emotions are visually represented on screen. They are outward. They're shown. It's a matter of drudgery, really, which is really interesting, I think.
Yeah, and you do definitely get her expressing emotions a lot more towards the end of the film, rather than at the beginning. She just seems very just kind of like, run down and just like,
for sure, just
unable to express. And then as the film goes on, she starts having more like outbursts towards Samuel. It's almost like a manic depressive kind of thing, because like she'll get into these modes of like screaming, and you hear her voice change, which is another kind of sound design thing that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Her voice actually goes much deeper, which most people's do when they are yelling and trying to intimidate in a way. It's just kind of an animal instinct.
The full force of the throat.
Right, but it has a huge impact in those moments. And then it'll be like in the same scene where she tells Samuel, well, if you're hungry, then why don't you eat shit? And so she yells at him, and then he just goes and like starts crying in his room, because that's obviously upsetting to a child. And she immediately comes into his room, and she's back to her normal voice, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that, and all that. And then like I think within another like 30 seconds, she's yelling at him about something else. So it's kind of this boomeranging between madness and her repressed kind of emotional self.
Yeah, she's sort of stuck in the stages of grief as a loop, moving between denial and anger and depression, and just sort of interchanging between those. And obviously the idea of depression in this movie is so closely tied with grief.
Right. I think that the type of depression in this film it's not like clinical depression. I think it's depression as a stage of grief, and the 5 stages of grief that you kind of you hit a few right there when you were saying that.
Yeah, it's not a process that is as linear as the stages of grief would make you believe. It is much more circuitous, and I think that this movie demonstrates that nature of the boomeranging, like you said, where it's moving back and forth. And it's one of those things where when you're watching the movie as a psychological horror movie and knowing who the Babadook is, it really sort of betrays the tone of the film in terms of that depression metaphor, especially because as I was watching the film, I was like, wow, this is not a metaphor for depression. This is just depression. It is just straightforward showing it. I think that this movie could almost be on the same, playing field as a normal drama movie, even without the Babadook element. It could be as, viscerally terrifying as it is without the supernatural. Just in the way that it portrays that depression and her personal descent into madness, and then the way that Samuel sort of brings her out of the madness as well.
Mm-hmm. Besides the Babadook, obviously, like this would not be a horror movie without the Babadook character, and it could easily be omitted. Really, the only reason to have it is for metaphorical purposes, and the inspiration for this movie was one of the directors, like single mother friends had a child who was like obsessed with being scared of like this one monster in this book that he was read to at night, kind of like the Babadook itself. So it's just like kind of like a plot device almost, and I feel like it's really not a horror movie otherwise.
Well, I don't know. That's the thing. I feel like it could be a psychological thriller without the Babadook, because, I mean, if you took out the sort of like pseudo-possession side of it, if you had Amelia still kill the dog and still try to hunt down Samuel, and Samuel sort of thwart her, I think that it could follow the same sort of train, because to me, it feels like The Shining, right?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like, I mean, it's definitely a horror movie. Don't get me wrong. I mean, like the Babadook being what it is. Like if you omit the Babadook being like the representation of her depression from her husband dying while she was in labor with Samuel, and therefore she has resentment for Samuel as her child, then
which
you
don't
get a horror movie.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying, and I would suppose that even my own comparison to The Shining would support your point, because there is a significant supernatural element to The Shining as well. But I was just saying that with this movie, there is so much of this domestic terror to it, in the way that Amelia treats Samuel. And I mean, it's so interesting because the film does this amazing job at the beginning of setting up Amelia as a sympathetic character. Like when we were first watching it, and I literally said to you, man, I feel for her. I get it. Like, I understand totally, because it's one, you're being weighed on by this feeling of grief at loss, but then also, this outstanding depression, which is truly a separate issue from actually being, resentful of Samuel. And then you on top of that have to also maintain a child who is in some ways in the film shown as troubled. But as much as I think that, I feel for Amelia, even throughout the film, I still feel for her too, because as much as it's a metaphor for depression, it's also showing the societal view of depression from the outside by showing Amelia's sister, who is just not understanding at all. She's, why don't you talk about it? Why don't you get over it? And it's one of those things where there is a little bit more nuance than just telling someone, just be happy. And the way that the other women talk about her as sort of this like broken person who is disadvantaged. And so there's this like view of the unwell that is also dramatically represented in the film. And I think that shows how much someone can undergo when dealing with these sort of circumstances. It makes the claustrophobia worse when you feel like not only are you trapped in the glass box, but people are watching you from the outside. And
you get kind of some glimpses into this, what's the right word? Kind of, I guess claustrophobia is as good a word as any, with her like constantly grinding her teeth, and like she's rubbing her temples a lot of the time, and they do have her like pull out her tooth later. I don't know what the implication is with that, but I got the impression that like she's kind of like nervously grinding her teeth, or just like or she's not grinding her teeth. That's Samuel that does that. She's like holding her jaw like as if it hurts from grinding her teeth at night, which is a sign of like stress and mental unwellness.
I sort of thought of it like as, I guess I didn't read it that way. I sort of saw it and I was just like, it's supposed to be almost like cavity-like and is a representation of the self. And there is a rot in the tooth that is paining her, just as there is a rot in her soul, which is the depression in the Babadook.
Yeah, That could be too. That's a good reading of that. It's a little more in depth than what I was thinking.
Oh, I was gonna say, because it's with the sort of exorcism of the tooth that the true Amelia is unleashed at the end, and that was like sort of the like final straw, that like she rips out the tooth, and then she's the part of her that was normal and motherly is gone completely.
Yeah, that could be. I don't know. I think that.
Grasping at straws here, Zach.
No,
it's up to interpretation.
Right. There is. Well, that's what's great about this movie is like there are clearly
she might just not brush.
Well, yeah. Can we just talk about how she rips that tooth out with her finger? She just takes it with two fingers and rips it out. she's got some mad grip strength. Anyways, there are these themes that are clearly at play here. With like child abuse and mental health and depression being part of that. But there's so much that is up for interpretation. Like what is pushing her to become more and more irritable throughout the film? Is it Samuel's behavioral issues? Is it her just because she's not dealing with her mental health issues that they're becoming worse and worse? And I think that those things are up for interpretation depending on how you see it.
Well, I mean, just as much as we've talked about her as the mother, she's also sort of on a trajectory in audience minds from the hero of the film to the villain of the film, and then Samuel goes from being the villain of the film because we see him and hate him and he's terrible, and then over the course of the film you start to put the pieces together that it's like, okay, he's acting out in this way because he never receives attention from her because of her depressive issues, and he also still has this undying love for her and ultimately saves her at the end of the movie through, a child's love. It's a reverse Harry Potter moment,
Yeah, no, I definitely have. That was one of the things I want to talk about is that the transformation of these two characters throughout the movie, they really do take that flip where it's kind of like you're viewing them as an outside force, which we really are as movie viewers. And if you notice, towards the beginning of the movie, we get more of the scenes that take place outdoors. So it's almost like you're taking this, what's the opposite of introspective?
Mm-hmm. Almost voyeuristic in a way.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And then as the film goes on, you get more scenes in their house, and you get this more introspective kind of inside perspective view of what is going on here, and that's when you start to turn towards, oh, maybe things aren't as they seem. And I think that's another theme that we get a lot. Samuel's magic video has that line of nothing in my hands, and then something about things are not always as they seem. And I think that is a huge thing. She's reading him the Big Bad Wolf story in the beginning of the movie, and that's the whole wolf in sheep's clothing idea. And they do show the Big Bad Wolf like cartoon later, and then there's also like a lot of mask imagery. So it really supports this idea that things aren't as they seem, and we do get that revealed to us, as you said, that with the kind of character role flips between Samuel and Amelia. Like in the beginning, Samuel is like Caillou levels of like I hate this child just because of the behavior, and it's like
he's so bad. I haven't seen a child that annoying in a film since Tum Tum in 1992's Three Ninjas.
we both had our jokes on that one. We had those ready and loaded. This is a highly produced podcast. What was I saying? Shit.
The perspective, outside perspective character
right,
switch.
Yeah, and we're both of us at the beginning. Like, I've seen this movie before, and still both of us at the beginning were like, oh, Samuel's the worst. Like, there's just so many things that he does wrong right at the beginning of the movie.
viscerally terrible.
Right. Because of the perspective that you get on it. And then, and it's obviously it becomes obvious that he's behaving in this way because of Amelia's, not so much complacency, but because of her, lack of, like, loving mothering that she does due to her depression from, assumingly from her husband passing away.
An unintentional withholding, really.
Yes, and that's hinted at a lot through the movie. It's not really hinted at; it's like just straight up shown. And that kind of brings me to where I think, since this is open for interpretation, like what is the Babadook? What is the Babadook to you?
It's interesting. I think that it is sort of a truer nature. It's funny because I didn't start thinking about sort of these ideas of, id and ego and superego and such until sort of digging a little deeper into the German expressionist ideas. But there is something very Germanic about him as a monster, and that I think that really he is a creation of Amelia. And I think that the creation of him is sort of the internal idea of her. And I get that sense because we never see the Babadook through the lens of anyone but Amelia, just like Samuel never gets to see the Babadook. Even like at the end of the movie where she's, screaming into the blackness and the house is shaking and we see the Babadook, like as he's rising up for a hug, which there's a nurturing imagery with that I'll talk about later. But it's sort of implied that Samuel doesn't see or interact with him ever. And in fact, when he's like throwing Samuel around the room, it's invisible. And we only see it have those invisible powers when it's using them on Samuel. And then at the end, he asks, will I ever get to see it? And she says no. So for me, the Babadook is a creation of Amelia, and it is a physical manifestation of that dark nature that is in her. It is not only the grief, but it is also the anger. And, at the end of the movie, it's sort of there's this, everything's fine idea, and she's able to, when it jumps at her, she's able to like calm it, and then we see her through its eyes. And to me, that's where it's really sort of the true nature coming through, that this is Amelia, it belongs to Amelia, and it was created in the car crash. I think that it's sort of implied that it was created in the car crash and born with Samuel.
I think we agree on most things here. Yeah, because like when it does come at her in the basement at the end, she then kind of like talks it down as if talking herself down, kind of like, okay, it's okay, like it's just me, and that kind of thing. And I think that comes after when she's talking to the child services people at the end, when it's Samuel's birthday. It's like right before his birthday party, and Samuel mentions to these child protective services people that it's his first actual birthday party. And they're like, wait, you've never had a birthday party for your child before? And she's like, it's first birthday party on the day. And they're like, oh, that's kind of odd. And then she tells them, yes, my husband died while he was driving me to the hospital, and blah, blah, blah. That's the first time where she actually is the one to say it, and there is this expression on her face as if she is accepting, and there is this air of acceptance in that. And I think that is what gives her, that's how you know it's all right. Because it gives her the ability to control it, to keep it in the basement, and to still have it, because that's, I think, a very big statement on mental health issues.
And grief.
Right, and grief is you can deal with grief, but it is scarring.
It's terminal. Yeah, it's not curable.
Right. It may feel like it goes away, but it's not gone. And that goes along with the you can never get rid of the Babadook idea, but you can contain it and you can deal with it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it speaks to the thing that I said earlier about the circuitous nature of grief. It's never a linear path. It's not lack of grief or no need for grief, and then you go through the stages and then you hit cured and you never experience it again. It's still something that is there, but is something that is controllable, or it is something that can be placated, or how to handle it. So with those ideas, I want to get your take on feeding it worms.
So before we get to that, actually, can I just say what I think the Babadook is?
Yeah, of course. You should. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree in a lot of ways. Just you said that it is Amelia's creation, and that's definitely evidenced by the fact that she says she has dabbled in writing kids' books before, and it's heavily implied that she's the one that wrote the Babadook book. There are actually a couple of scenes where she has like some ink on her fingertips, so it's kind of like hinting at that. And then the fact that when she is like purging the Babadook, like after Samuel like kind of helps her through that like kind of fit, she vomits ink. So it's very clear that okay, this is
that's great.
Her literary creation. Yeah, it's a really nice touch to it.
I actually never considered it being ink, and I've watched other people talk about this movie, and it's always through the perspective of it just being like this black bloody bile that she's ejecting from her, that is supposed to be releasing the possession of the Babadook. But to actually call it ink is, I think, really astounding, and I like that a lot.
That is, I didn't even consider it to be like the actual possession. Like it's not like some Conjuring, like in the Conjuring when she like vomits up the basically the demon. I think it just looks so inky and like thick, and maybe it's not intended to be, I don't know, but that's how I saw it. And I think the Babadook, I actually think that the Babadook is kind of like, it's obviously related to her grief for her husband, but I think it's more representative of her resentment for Sam, just because of what the Babadook book says with the more you deny, the stronger I get. Let me in and I'll get under your skin. And it does end up like kind of it's not really a possession because it's always been there. I guess consuming is a better word.
Yeah. The reason that I get possession from it is because it has sort of a mirror to The Conjuring, where the Babadook is on the ceiling above her and then it dives into her mouth, and it's sort of that mouth open, eyes rolled back sort of takeover. And I would say, it's that idea of infestation, oppression, and possession that she goes through. And that's, something from The Conjuring. The infestation of grief, the oppression of grief, and then the total takeover. And in your case, it's the infestation, that kernel of thought that says you hate your son. And then to the actual oppression of Amelia as a positive force, and then total takeover. So yes, I agree with your assertions.
Yeah, there's just like an overwhelming amount of evidence of Samuel basically being abused and neglected, and he comes in after she's been drugging him. She obviously is giving him too much of this tranquilizer. And he comes in and he's like, oh, my stomach's upset and like I just need food. Like there's no food in the house and I'm hungry. And that's the scene that I talked about earlier. And and then he like has this cry for help. He tells the child services people about the drugs she's been giving him. It's like, it's like a cry for help. And then there is this moment. There are so many moments where Samuel's saying, oh, I love you, Mom, and I'll do anything to protect you. And she just kind of like shrugs it off. And then there's one time Samuel says, I love you, Mom. And she says back to him, she says, me too. She like Han Solos her child. And it's very heavily implied. Well, it's not heavily implied. It's just kind of like an off the cuff thing. It just seems like, oh, okay, so she doesn't want to say that she loves him.
Yeah, for sure.
And then there's that moment in the car, which people have made a meme out of, with the "why can't you just be normal?" And what you don't see in the meme is when Samuel looks right behind Amelia right after she says that, and he says, "Get out." And then the scene after that, he's talking to Amelia about how he doesn't want her to let the Babadook in. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of like a moment of like, to me, it's just like the Babadook seems to be related to those moments where she has just aggression towards Samuel. So to me, it just seems like that's really what it's about, and that I don't know, that just seems like the primary function of the Babadook to me. And then like the whole like depression and grief over her husband is just kind of like the fuel for that.
I get what you mean, and I think that it is important to the actual story, and we really get the sense of that, the scope of it, at what to me was the intersection point of their characters' journeys, which is when they're in the car and she yells at him, "Why can't you be normal?" And he screams, and then she screams, and then he looks above her and a little bit to the right and yells, "Get out," because that's, when they then are attacked, quote unquote, by the Babadook. And that's really where that flip happens. So I totally agree. I do think it is resentment. And I think that it's grief, but it could also be an element of survivor's guilt. Like, why did we survive, versus, him? Because that's always part of it too. And I think that she takes, a personal responsibility or a personal failing for the loss of her husband, because you can't blame Samuel for her husband's death. It's not his fault. And that's the thing. I think that there is an element of projection onto him, as is the case in a lot of these, situations where parents are resentful of their children. It is a matter of projection of things that they don't like about themselves. Because what was the last thing that her husband said to her?
I don't remember.
It was about her and Samuel, and I think that she assumed that her husband, was talking to Samuel in those final moments rather than to her, which is sort of almost like a matter of jealousy too, that he spent his last seconds, speaking to their unborn child and paying attention to him rather than, paying attention to the road and to keeping them safe. And so I think that there's this whole idea of projection there too. Absolutely. But the worm, Zach.
But the worm. I was just getting back to that. So a thought just occurred to me, because whenever they show the Babadook, there's kind of like this insect, like almost like a cicada kind of like noise going on in the background. And then when Amelia is all irritable, sometimes they have that noise in the background. And then there's that one scene in her bedroom where it's like the Babadook is supposed to have possessed her, and then Samuel like wets his pants because he's so afraid of her. There's that noise in the background, and I was like thinking this insect kind of sound imagery that's going on. Maybe the worms are like she's like turned back the clock and sent them to like the larva phase, and like she's reduced the grief to its infancy. I don't know. That's my best guess.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there is a lot of insect imagery in the movie as a whole, and I think that it is sort of used. To me, it was almost like a Kafka-esque representation in a way, because we see the cockroaches coming out of the wall, and we are immediately repulsed by them, and that's just the nature of humans and cockroaches. But we also see that Amelia collects insects at the beginning of the movie. She has all of these insects. She or Samuel, I'm not sure who the actual collector is, has all of these insects in these glass displays on their counter. right before, Samuel breaks the mirror, we see them. So we see these like interesting sort of insects that are trapped in glass. And I think that it's part of the like naturalistic idea of voyeurism, looking into the glass, and then also the claustrophobia therein. But that's a different thing. And so we almost get this like Kafkaesque transformation of her as movement to this like repulsive monster that the Babadook also represents, because the Babadook is clearly a reference to Nosferatu as well. This sort of like parasitic, vampiric the monster that is feeding off of her darkness, and it's able to thrive. And then it feeds off of her and off of the sort of grossness of the cockroaches and the repulsion. And then we go to the end of the movie and she's feeding it worms, and we see before this her gardening. And so it's supposed to be this idea of like life and growth, because a healthy garden is one that contains worms, because obviously worms are used for nurturing the soil that allows things to grow. They're, good for it. And so it's almost like she's feeding the Babadook that resentment, that grief, these worms as this symbol of healthiness, or trying to return it to a place of natural health, return it to nature in a way. And so it sort of represents her now being able to actively feed the thing to keep it healthy, rather than sort of ravenous and, unstoppable. That's how I interpreted it.
Yeah, that I like that better than my off the cuff kind of forced interpretation.
It's a weird one.
Well, it's kind of like you could go with like the whole worms and like rotting kind of idea if you really wanted to. That's very common in horror movies, but I don't think that's where this is going. I didn't even notice. But
I like the idea of the worms as healthy in this.
Yeah, no, I would more lean towards that than unhealthy. And I didn't notice that they collected insects at the beginning. I guess I didn't catch that.
Yeah, there's also a poster of a magician on the wall.
Yeah, so you kind of hinted at like that's where the Babadook comes from, like that kind of like Nosferatu kind of idea. And if you look at
the top hat is the magician,
right? You can tell, like, let's just assume that she's the one that made the Babadook character for the Babadook book. It seems like she took the inspiration from the magician. And like Samuel is doing that magic trick at the beginning of the movie for her, where he's wearing the top hat in the cave, and it's like writers or artists they sometimes subconsciously take inspiration from their past experiences. Like, Matt's a composer. Matt knows this well, I'm sure.
I am.
Where you'll write something, you'll go, wait, that's already been written. This is a piece of music I heard like 2 weeks ago. I know I've done that before. And
what?
so
there's never. Definitely not intentionally, every once in a while.
All of Matt's ideas are completely original. Let that be on the record. Anyways, that does happen to artists, and that's kind of like the idea that's going on here, is that she's taking these these images that she sees and making this character out of that. Bringing it back to like what you mentioned at the beginning of just the atmosphere.
Being an LGBT icon? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about that for half a second here. Do you have any idea why that might be, besides that Netflix had it classified as an LGBTQ like iconic film?
I don't know why they would have done that. No, I can't imagine how that would have came to be. But the thing was, it sort of became a meme, and then it was showing up at pride festivals everywhere. It was showing up in like political campaigns and slogans, and people, in a really funny sort of ironic way, people endorsed the Babadook or used him as like a supportive figure of pride. Like, he became for a while sort of this like symbol that was pro LGBT, which I thought was hilarious how people took it and just ran with it.
The metaphor extends into the real world.
The metaphor extends, yeah.
Yeah. So, do you want to do some questions?
You know I do. This is my favorite part of the podcast.
When he says that, he means that it's his least favorite part of the podcast.
It's really not. It's one of my favorite parts. I love being quizzed on things that are like fun and not like actually being quizzed, because that sucks. But in this case, I'm just like, yeah, test my knowledge.
This all started because I knew you would have fun with being like tested. You would have fun with having your knowledge on The Thing tested, because you've seen that movie so many times. And now it's just, I think, a lot of our friends who listen have grown to really like this part of the episode. So got to keep doing it, right? So that being said, today's trivia is brought to you by Campbell's Potato and Glass Shard Soup. Matt, have you ever been eating your potato soup and thought there aren't enough glass shards in it?
Zach, I have, but tell me more. How can I get more glass shards in my potato soup?
You can get more glass shards by, 1, getting a can of ragu, smashing it on the ground, getting the ragu up with a rag and throw that rag in the garbage, and then pick up the shards of glass and put it in your soup. Or you can just buy Campbell's Potato and Glass Shard Soup.
What the hell?
So, truth be told, I couldn't figure out a name, like a pun.
We're gonna get sued by Campbell's.
I hope so. That's how. That's how we blow up.
Why would you
what would
hope
get us
that?
more listeners than having a lawsuit with Campbell's? Come on.
This is a reference to the movie, just
Yes.
for legal reasons. Reference to the movie
Yes,
when
this is a
there's
reference
glass
to the
shards
movie.
in the soup.
So, here we go. The phrase Babadook means he is coming for sure in what language?
I'm gonna go with Finnish.
It's actually Hebrew.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
Which is the same origin for the name Samuel.
It's interesting that it ties so well with the anagram for bad book.
Yeah, I mean...
That they found something that works in both Hebrew and as an anagram, I mean.
Okay, next question. The director of what movie said that The Babadook is the most terrifying film he has ever seen?
I don't know, James Wan?
It was William Friedkin, and he's the one who directed The Exorcist.
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't have thought of William Friedkin.
Yeah, I wouldn't have either, considering I consider The Exorcist to be more frightening than this, but I don't know. Maybe that's just
me too, actually.
This is more... I would guess William Friedkin has children.
Yeah.
I could see if you have children that this would probably be the more terrifying. Although The Exorcist has everything to do with children too, so I don't know. Mm-hmm. And then this is the last question that I have. And you already kind of mentioned it. I wrote, the film of which horror film director appears on the TV during the like TV dream sequence scene, and you already have said it's Mario Bava.
It's so Mario Bava's
that's given away. But do you know
Black
what
Sabbath.
movie? Black Sabbath, right? So
Black Sabbath.
You heard it here, folks. Matt knows his horror movies.
Well, thank you everyone for listening to this week's episode of Watch No Evil Babadook Edition. I'm Matt.
And I'm Zach.
And we'll catch you next week.